All right. Okay, so this is Brian Hass's tribute to the great Al Hinkle for his memorial wake at the Cafe Stritch in San Jose. Same place where there was the Carolyn Cassady tribute. Was it 5 years ago, 4 or 5 years ago? The great best friend of the Hinkles. The Cassadys and the Hinkles were best friends from the get-go. So now they are all reunited back at the big playroom in heaven, playing pinochle and chess with each other. Once again reunited. And one thing about that I was thinking about these guys is everybody knows Kerouac and Cassady, and Kerouac was a great written storyteller, witness all the books and the novels, and Cassady was a famous verbal storyteller. Also wrote, of course, the Joan Anderson letter that changed Jack's approach to writing, the great story that he told to Jack and that made Jack think to write novels that were like a person sitting next to you in a bar telling you a great story. And part of where he got that idea from was from Neal Cassady. Well, what people don't know is Al Hinkle, their third man, in their infamous road trio, was a great storyteller as well. People don't know this, but first of all, he was a natural at it. Secondly, he had an amazing memory. He lived to, I think he was 92. He just passed, and he loved his storytelling, and he had a fabulous memory. This is another extraordinary thing that sadly we've lost so many of the great storytellers in history too soon. Al made it to 90 plus, and his stories were articulate, vivid, lively, funny. The guy, he cracked himself up, and that was, I think that's always a great sign. Well, it makes anybody who cracks themselves up, cracks up those around them, and it cracks me up. And if you're sitting there listening to a guy telling a story and he's breaking up in the middle of telling it, and he can barely get through it because he's laughing so much at the memories, that's a heck of a good story. And Al was that, and so that was one of the many wonderful things about him. And he had this incredible memory, and like he could rattle off street names and stuff. And I would go and check because I got to hang out with him a few times and to tell stories, and sometimes I'd audio record them and sometimes video record them. And I'd go and check later to see if he had like the street names right or the dates or something. And he was immaculate. Like I never, got him on tape making a mistake. So there was that. And another funny thing was cars, which he always called, to the day he died, as I jokingly say, but I think it's probably literally true, he never said the word car in his life. They were, until the day he died, automobiles. Because he came of age when, they were sort of a new invention, and they were a big important thing, and they were an automobile. Car, by the time a lot of us came along later, cars were everywhere, and so they were just cars. But for Al, till the day he died, they were automobiles. And if any time he's telling you a story, he will mention the make and the model of the car in question. Well, we got in, I had a 38 Buick at the time, and I picked up Neil, and we went da-da-da-da-da. So it was just sort of a funny detail that I loved about the guy. He was just so charming and funny, and I'm so glad I got to meet him because luckily, as most of you know by now, I was lucky enough, as chronicled in this here book, The Hitchhiker's Guide to Jack Kerouac, was able to meet almost all of the living Beat people in 1982 as I was a 21-year-old pup. And but I didn't meet Al. Al did not come, and I didn't really find this out. It's going to be in the next edition of the book. Why Al Hinkle was not there at Boulder 82, the famous Boulder 82, where there was the biggest gathering of beats that ever occurred, and Al wasn't there. Why wasn't Al there? Well, I've just found out recently that it was because he was running for the Libertarian seat in Congress for, I guess, San Francisco. which would be, I guess that's Nancy Pelosi's seat now. But in 1982, he was the official Libertarian candidate, and with the year of the big summit in Boulder. And he was also kind of out of the, you know, Beat Inc. world. He wasn't part of the sort of the circuit of everybody that was out there blabbing their heads off about the Beat generation like so many were. And thank goodness they were, because they've passed on a torch that millions of people all over the world are still carrying, and lighting, candles being lit over manuscripts, you know, from Europe to South America to all over Canada and the US of A, of people still writing wonderful, poetic, romantic, exploratory adventure stories and poems, because that Beat light has been kept lit. But Al was not part of that for a long time, and there was the 5 famous documentaries that were, again, all made at the Boulder 82 thing, and I'll chronicle them all here at the end of the book, all of the 5 documentaries shot at the summit. And Al is not in any of them, and even though the great filmmakers, documentarians, shot a lot of it there, they then went and, you know, found and tracked down people who weren't there, Gary Snyder, Father Spike in Lowell, and all sorts of others, but not Al. And for some reason, whatever it was, he was kind of out of the circuit for a long time, and forever. And so it was really, I'm pretty sure that it was 2012 when I saw Walter Salles' documentary, In Search of On the Road, which only screened in theaters 3 times ever, anywhere. In San Francisco, once ever in Bloomington, Indiana, home of The Wizard of Wonder, and once in New York City. And I was at 2 of those screenings. But it was at the one in Bloomington was the first time I saw it, and Al's in it. And, you know, I have personal memories of, like, all of the Beats who were still alive by 1982. Really, about the only 2 I ever missed hanging out with were Jack and Neil. Died in 68 and 69. But anyway, so I'm watching this doc, and there's Al, being funny, charming, kind. It just, kindness just exudes from him, with an impish prankster's leprechaun twinkle and smile and little upturn in the corners of his mouth, because everything's a joke. And I'm watching him and going, oh man, like, he was already really old in 2012. What would he have been? Whatever, somebody do the math. But he was, I think he was born in 26. Anyway, and I was like, oh man, I wish I met Al, too bad, and I hope I do before he dies, but he already looked really old, you know. And then, God bless, I was able to in 2015 when I went out there for the big Beat shindig put on by the Beat Museum in 2015, and Jamie Cassady and the Cassady family, and we went out there and had a whole day with Al, because they had all kind of grown up together. But watching that documentary in 2012, I remember, first of all, like, I was like, I want to meet this guy, and because he was such a good storyteller, and that was the first time he ever really showed up in a documentary. I mean, he's not in any of those 5 that were shot at Boulder 82. I'm sure he's not in The Source, so I don't know where else he might be on film, except for Walter's documentary. And so John Cassady and I were watching this together. It was a great moment. And Al's telling one of the many stories about Jack and Neil and he goes, well, you know, we were doing this and that, and well, there may have been a little marijuana involved. And both John and I out loud blurbed, a little bit. And it, like, completely unrehearsed, and just spontaneously said it in the same cadence at the exact same time, both of us as incredulous as the other about a little bit. And knowing Al, and then getting to know him, though, you know, he, as Jack and Neil were somewhat a bit ahead of the curve on this whole pot thing. You know, and now I think it's legalized in California and Oregon and all of Canada and whatever, 30 states or something. It has some form of legalization now. And here were these guys way back in the early days, you know, making no bones about it. And another thing, he was also, speaking of ahead of the curve and keeping it all the way to the end, he was a ladies' man. And, you know, as much as we think about that with Neal Cassady, Al Hinkle was no slouch on picking up the girls. And the girls falling for him, as they did everywhere he went, frankly. And he told many stories about that. Oh, and speaking of the many stories, one thing I wanted to clarify. In On the Road, Jack refers to him as, I believe, a mindless cad. In the famous 1948 trip where Al and Neal and Al's wife Helen leave San Francisco and go across the country and meet up with Jack in North Carolina and go to New York and New Year's Eve and all of the events of the book, and then back to New Orleans to Burroughs' place. Anyway, you know, Jack sort of like because Al had just met Helen, who I don't think he was, I'm not sure if they were married. They had just met, and they were going to get married immediately if they weren't already. And Al brings Helen in the car in the famous 1949 Hudson that Al paid the last $100 out of his pocket for Neal Cassady to buy that car that took them on the road and into history. And that was paid for by Al, but or at least the remaining money that they needed to get it. But anyway, the thing was about Al was, and so it's sort of like, oh God, the guy, he meets this girl, brings her in this car trip, and, you know, and then dumps her in Tucson to take a train to freaking Bill Burroughs' house to stay with them while Al and Neal cavort across the country on a road trip. And it was often thought that this was not a nice thing to do. But I found out through Al that, in fact, the way he described it was he knew that he had met the love of his life in Helen. And that she was uncomfortable in the car. And he mentions, and so I guess I can, that, you know, in those days women wore girdles, if you can imagine such a thing. And that they were in this car, and she's in there wearing this girdle on this long trip where Neal, you know, kind of intends to drive all the way to the freaking East Coast nonstop. And, you know, she wants to get a hotel room and have a good night's sleep and be a normal human being. And so it was actually Al being kind to her to say, listen, you know, we got to go, and we're going to go and help Jack move to, what was it, move from New York to North Carolina. I can't even remember, from North Carolina to New York, whatever, that crazy trip that's in On the Road. And so he was actually being really kind and considerate, and got Helen, he had a pass on the railroad, and got Helen all squared away to take the train to Burroughs' place, and had her a place squared away to stay at, because he loved her. And he thought they were going to just be gone a couple, 2-3 days to make this quick run and come back. And of course it turned into more because of the characters he was with, and they got to New York, and it turned into a New Year's Eve and all of that. So he was a little bit longer, but then when he came back, he ended up staying, if you remember the events of the book that were accurately portrayed, he ended up staying with Burroughs in Tangier, and not continuing on to, or Algiers, sorry. And why did he do that, right? It was because he loved Helen. And they stayed there an extra couple of days, and then he was like, I'm treating my woman properly, and took her to the French Quarter, and proceeded to rent a house, a room in a house, a nice place right in the French Quarter, and gave her a 3-month honeymoon. So the two of them could be in the French Quarter in New Orleans, and he treated her right. And it was funny, he was getting unemployment from the railroad because it was the off season, and then he got this really kind of cushy, crazy job from a guy who owned a tile business right next door to the place that they were staying. And he needed somebody in there to answer the phone and show people tiles in the odd, rare instance where they came in. And so he was getting, I think he said $18 a day off the books. And Helen was free to explore the French Quarter in New Orleans all on her own during the day. And then he was making all this money, which was good money at that time, to take her out on the town every night. So I thought that was kind of a really illustrative of what a kind and generous guy Al was. And is not really necessarily known in all of history, but it's true. And he was thoughtful and considerate. And another thing I was thinking too is that a lot of times the Beats are thought of to be like irresponsible bums or something. But, you know, Al got his degree at San Francisco State and then and worked for 40-something years on the Southern Pacific Railway. And then also took master's courses in geography at Stanford. So that is, you know, that's a responsible guy. And, you know, Kerouac, for however much booze the poor guy got addicted to and indulged in, if you check today, there are over 50 different books that he wrote in print. And I'm not talking about multiple editions of On the Road or any other book. 50 different books that he wrote that are in print. That is not a slacker or a do-nothing or a lazy, you know, beatnik bum. And same with Neal. Never missed a day at the Southern Pacific Railroad in his 10 or 12 years that he was there. He got injured and he was off a couple of times. And it was sometimes seasonal work, but he never missed a day's work that he was scheduled to work in all the years that he was there. So this kind of concept that somehow these beat guys were ne'er-do-wells and irresponsible, you know, I think history actually tells a different story. Oh, and just one other kind of funny little thing about maybe people know it, but the famous story about the 49 Hudson, that it cost they could, for $25, they could either get a heater or a radio in that famous car. And Neal famously chose a radio, and we all think that, oh, you know, kind of maybe an irresponsible guy because they ended up, you know, being cold. But the whole plan was, at the time, they were going to take the southern route and go along kind of, you know, the southern tip of America and then get to Florida and then cut up to North Carolina. So there was more than mild method to his madness. But it wasn't until they got sort of due south of Denver that old Neal got in his head that to hang a sharp left and bolt on up to Denver to pick up Luann. And that was how they ended up in the mountains, but and the cold and all of that. But in December 48. But so that they really were thinking practically that, well, we're going to be taking the southern route. We're not going to need the heater, so let's definitely have a radio so when we're going through places like New Orleans, we can listen to the jazz, man. And so that was just kind of one of many other little tips. And just about music. Al loved music, and like if you visited him at his house, in the background you were going to be hearing all the time you were there, Billie Holiday, Ella Fitzgerald, Miles Davis, Bud Powell, Charlie Parker, and they loved Peggy Lee. But so he was still listening to and loving his jazz until the very end. And one other little thing, a little anecdote he shared that I loved was when he was living with Helen, she loved classical music. And as he phrased it, the radio got turned on before the coffee machine did in the Hinkle household. And it was always on this radio station, KIBE, out of, I think, San Jose, for you radio history buffs. And he said, and so there was just, as he described it, there were just symphonies playing all day long, every day in the Hinkle household. And so think of the education, the wonderful appreciation for music that his son and daughter got living in a household with classical music on all the time, except when they played jazz 78s. So, you know, what a neat cultural life this guy who worked at the Southern Pacific Railroad had for, you know, all those gazillion years. Oh, and another New Orleans story, which was fortunate. So he was there for Mardi Gras, and the year they were there, as he said, they had 5 giant parades for Mardi Gras, and I think now they maybe only have 1, but back then they had 5. And luckily, the year he was there, no less than Louis Armstrong was, they called it, in that the parade he was in, he was the King of the Zulus. You know, sort of the Grand Marshal of the parade. But, and he got to meet him. And I mean, Louis Armstrong, I mean, that's, you know, he just invented jazz, that's all. But so that, you know, and you could see Al's face light up in his 80s and his 90s, telling stories about getting to meet Louis Armstrong and shake his hand. And I mean, it's like what kids, you know, today with, you know, Taylor Swift or whomever, just that he had that kind of joy and was able in his life to live it, to catch these people live. And you know, still to his dying day was one of the thrills of his life, was to shake Louis Armstrong's hand. So I always loved that. And he told so many stories, and I hope more of them are able to come out. Somebody needs to write a good biography on him. Oh, there was a great one. The great Steve Eddington from Nashua, New Hampshire, and part of the whole Grateful Dead community, Grateful Dead. The Beat Kerouac community put this book together using a phrase Al loved, like to jokingly call himself the last man standing. And this has got some interviews and other anecdotes. I think this might be just about the only bit of Al you can find in print, but because he had stories and was as good at telling them as those 2 other more famous characters that he hung around with, let me tell you. Including one that not many people know about. Did you know this? That Al Hinkle was and Neal Cassady were a trapeze act in a circus. True story. He tells it better. I mean, he tells it well in a few different places, and I think I've got it in part on videotape, so that hopefully I can get some of this stuff out before too long. But they were. It was actually, it turned out it was Hal Chase's uncle, I think, was sort of rich or something, and he had sort of a small touring circus that I guess eventually went sort of belly up or something, and he donated all of the circus stuff to the YMCA in Denver. And so they got the idea to put on a circus for kids. And so they had I guess the nets and the, you know, the flying trapezes and the whips and the whatever all is in a, you know, a 1940s circa, 1930s circus. And Al was a big, strong guy, and Neal was a strong, petite, wiry guy. And so, believe it or not, they were an actual trapeze act. And Al Hinkle was the guy who caught the flying through the air Neal Cassady. And this was at age 13. And they didn't, then that was that. They just did this thing for a summer, and that was that. And then they went their separate ways, and they went to different schools and never saw each other again. And it wasn't until, you know, 5 or so years later that Al went into the pool hall in Denver, and I guess they had, what was his name? Jimmy Holmes. They may have known him in common. And they're in this pool hall, and they're hanging out, and sort of looking at each other, and, you know, eventually it hits, I think I know you. And it twigs that they had been actually, you know, had been this trapeze act together 5 long years when you're a teenager. 13 might as well be the last century when you're 18. But they were able to piece together their prior friendship. And it reminds me of, I'm also a big Larry David fan, and he and Richard Lewis knew each other, who then now has sort of a regular, big, kind of recurring part in Curb Your Enthusiasm. But those two guys knew each other at like a summer camp that they both went to, again, around the age 13 or maybe a little younger. And saw each other in summer camp for one summer. That was that. They went their separate ways. And then in their 20s, found themselves both in the comedy clubs in New York and were like, I think I know you from somewhere. And so I love those stories of people who, have these important, brief connections and then never see each other again, and then the fates bring them in harmony together again in another circumstance. And then there's that really deep bond that there was between Al and Neal, which was so important. And he was, the Cassadys wouldn't have been the Cassadys if it wasn't for the Hinkles. They held those guys together, and when Neal got busted, Al came up with the money so Carolyn wouldn't lose the house, and a lot of and just Helen became, I asked her about this too, it was about that the guys really liked going out together, Neal and Al and Jack when he was in town. And when Carolyn asked to go out with them one time, as she describes in, I think, Off the Road, and it might even be in On the Road as well, that, she didn't have a good time, and they went out and, Neal was trying to score pot. And so they were kind of on they were waiting around for the guy to come home to get the pot from, and seemed incredibly boring to Carolyn. And they went out to some club, and it was really stupid, and everybody was drunk and all that. And she was like, well, this is kind of dumb. I don't really enjoy this. And neither did Helen. And so they loved their guys, and their guys loved to go out and have this kind of fun. But Carolyn and Helen were smart, super well read, but they weren't really into going out and scoring crappy pot and going to drunken jazz joints. But they really did enjoy just hanging out together, and so that's a lot of how couples become good friends, is when each of the two genders like each other, and then the two couples can then get to spend a lot of time together because the two members of each of the genders really dig their time together, and then that makes a nice foursome. And that's what the Cassadys and the Hinkles were for their entire life, and including, Helen sadly passed away, but Al and Carolyn stayed in touch right till the end, and it was a beautiful thing. So there's some Al stories. I hope you enjoyed them. Just a wonderful guy that is not well enough known in the beat world, and maybe through this a little bit you got to know him a smidge better, and maybe you get this book, and maybe some other books come out, and Al's story gets told, and hopefully we can get old Walter Salles to release that In Search of On the Road documentary, because there's a whole lot of Al in that. So this is for the upcoming memorial at the Cafe Stritch. I wrote a little poem for Al, and so I thought I'll share that with you now from up here in lovely downtown Canada all the way there to lovely California. Some metamorphosis. Al Hinkle, hero of the humble, gracious giant, gentle giant, a literary giant's character for eternity, still alive in every copy of On the Road in every country in the world. The lovable, affable, portable, big Ed Dunkel. The everyman in the car. Not a Cassady, not a Kerouac, but a you, a me. Everyone who wasn't a hero could be in that car in the person of Al, blocking the wind, running for smokes, driving through nights, playing with folks, and planting the flag in the Southern Pacific Railroad earth that beckoned the charmers, the dreamers, conductors of generations of players in the symphonies of cultures, that filled the halls and spiked the balls and wooed the dolls with an easy laugh and a generous hand. Al was a man who had a plan to hit the road and not be told what to do, because he already knew it's up to you to catch your magnificent friends on the flying trapeze. Al always practiced this, taught this, caught this, shared this. A hero of the humble, an explorer of the quiet, a romantic of the road, a swashbuckler of the rails, a watchman with cocktails, a map man with muggles, a Helen man with snuggles, a mighty man who juggles 90 years of adventures into one magic trick of life. We should all be so lucky, as everyone who knew him was. The great Al Hinkle. Enjoy those pinochle and chess games back with Neil and Helen and Carolyn in heaven, my brother. I was so glad to have known you on this plane, and I look forward to joining you on the next one. Whenever I get there, we'll pick up our conversations and I'll keep laughing at you laughing. So thanks for sharing your life with so many on this earth, Al. Big Ed Dunkel, forever in all of our hearts and all of our books on all of our shelves.